Hello, this is a video for SOEN6441, Advanced Programming Practices. This is for week 4. So this week there's going to be two parts of the lecture. One is on API documentation tools, and the other one is on unit testing frameworks. So this first video is about API documentation tools. So again, this is going to be how to show you how to use a tool that is, I would say, accessory to the act of programming in a software engineering project. One of the tools I've chosen, which is very predominantly used also on the workforce, is Javadoc, which allows you to somehow generate documentation, like informative documentation about the constituents of all the pieces or the units of a software that you are building. So for example, if you're building, say, a library or say, a publicly available piece of software that you can post on the internet, for example, the entire documentation describing all the classes and all the member functions of these classes so that people can actually use it effectively. By extension, as you are developing the software, very often it might be useful for the developers themselves to actually have access to this documentation so that they can be aware. Sometimes you're building software, there's a lot of different classes. You might not be involved in the development of another part. Well, maybe you have to use this other part, so it may be useful to actually have comprehensive and useful documentation for all the parts so that everybody involved can actually see the documentation for all the other parts that they are not involved in. So there, of course, used to be that you would have documentation for software, um, uh, the internal code of software. Here, I'm not talking about, let's say, a user manual. I'm talking about the documentation of the code, of how to actually use the code and what's the structure of the code, what are all the classes for in this code, and what are all the methods for in this code, and how to, explanation as to how you should properly use every component of the code. Now, of course, you could design this documentation manually, and that's what used to be done. People would essentially write a document describing the code. Now, this is not very efficient way of doing when you have to manually write documentation. Now, solutions like Javadoc, which is the tool that I'm going to advocate that you use in the project, they actually, how it works is it allows you to actually write your documentation, or I might say the source of your documentation inside of your code. So it used to be when you had manual documentation that people would write the code and then someone else or the same person would, on the side, go and write a document describing what this code is. Difficulty here and the problem is that as you're changing the code, then you must remember to actually fix the documentation. What's happening with tools like Javadoc is that the actual source or the information that is used in the documentation is written inside of the code itself in form of comments, specially formatted comments. So that has an effect, which is very important, of somehow coupling the documentation in sync with the development of the code itself. So then it raises the question as to you must have a certain introduce a habit of actually writing the documentation as at the same time as you're writing the code. Much of the tools that I'm advocating to use in this course are of the same kind. From this regard is that the most important thing is to get the habit of actually using these tools as you do coding. Many programmers, they are very good at coding, but if you ask them to do other tasks that are on the side, so they think, compared to coding, that's going to have to require habit building. Okay, the use of Javadoc is the same too, because one of the things is that if you write code and then you don't write documentation, and people rely on the documentation in order to understand code, and you don't have documentation for some of the code, then the documentation is incomplete. Also, if a programmer changes code and then forgets to change the documentation, then the documentation becomes obsolete, which is somehow makes the whole documentation not useful or even detrimental, because it's telling you things that are wrong about the the documentation is telling you wrong things about what the actual code is after having been changed. Sorry. So it used to be manual documentation. Of course, we don't want that. It's very inefficient. It's very error prone. And then that's basically an entirely different procedure to actually write the documentation if it's done manually compared to write the code. Tools like Javadoc, they enable you to write the documentation as you write the code, and the documentation actually sits inside of the code itself. So what's the goal of this here? Because again, this is, we're talking about software engineering here. So it has to be, if you're using a tool, as I'm explained for the other tools before that I'm advocating in this course, there has to be some kind of economic aspect to actually use a tool. The use of a tool must be economically viable. Okay, so if you compare the cost of using a tool versus the positive effect of using a tool, I mean, there must be more positive effect than there is cost. So what is the positive effect of using an API documentation generation tool? It actually makes your code more understandable. As I explained earlier, for other things I'm advocating in this course, being able to understand code is very important, especially if you're using incremental software development where the code is changing all the time. And inevitably also code is written by other people. So if you want to read other people's code, it has, it's not your own code. So you have to be able to understand it as quickly as possible. Okay. So the more there's clear documentation to actually describe this code, and the more useful and browsable, quickly browsable is the documentation, the more you spend less time to actually understand the code base in your project. And the more you're advancing, the more you have to apply changes very quickly, the more you have a better understandability, the more quickly you can go and basically produce more code in the same time frame compared to if you don't have documentation. Now, of course, here we're talking about generating a document. Now, as I explained earlier, if you're generating the document by hand, for example, using Microsoft Word to provide a documentation for your code, it's going to be very time consuming. Okay. So as much as possible, you want to rely on automation. Okay. So these tools, this API documentation generation tool, such as Javadoc, it's essentially Javadoc is a compiler that compiles your code as well as the Javadoc that is in your code and automatically generates hypertext documentation. Okay. So without this automation, it's not economically viable. Okay. Also, the hypertext, having hypertext documentation, so you have some links and then you can browse through the code extremely efficiently. Yes, if you're using an IDE, there are some keys you can press to actually jump between different classes and so on. For example, if you're reading a piece of code and it's using a certain class, for example, as a data member, as the type of a data member, then you can click and use a key to actually jump right away to this code to the code defining this class. So yes, you can do this in IDE, but the API documentation is providing you exactly that also in a single place where all the documentation is available. Okay. So being able to jump between different portions of the code very quickly is a very important feature, which is provided by hypertext documentation. And the automated tool actually reads, the Javadoc, for example, reads your entire code and then extracts information from the code and then generates automatically the documentation. Extremely efficient. Also, every time you make a change to the code and make a change to the comments, you can just press a button and then generates the code very quickly. So automation is a very important aspect of usage of a tool like this. So let's go to, that was for API generation tools. There are many such tools. Provided a link in the references at the end if you want to look. There's actually dozens and dozens of the systems like this. I would say the most popular ones are Javadoc. Javadoc is mostly related only to Java. There's also another one which is much more flexible. It can accommodate different languages called Doxygen. There are others also that are flexible. Doxygen is one of the most popular ones. So if you're using a different language, Javadoc is for Java. If you're using a different language, you might have to use a different tool. So it might be more worth your effort if you are to work with different languages to actually learn one tool that works for different languages, such as Doxygen. So what is a Javadoc? So Javadoc it's a piece of software that is actually part of Java Software Development Kit. So it's part of the release of Java. And its goal is to actually generate API documentation for your Java source and project. Javadoc is the industry standard for such a purpose especially for Java. Most people that will want to do this to do API documentation in a Java project would be using Javadoc. So how does this work? So as I mentioned earlier, instead of writing your own document on the side, let's say using Microsoft Word or any other kind of documentation software, then you would actually be writing your comments inside of your code base. And the way you do it, as I will show later, you provide this code inside of specially formatted comments. So the Javadoc source is essentially in the comments, some of the comments of your code in your Java program. So what is the Javadoc tool? Javadoc tool is essentially a compiler that reads your program. For example, you can instruct it to read one of your Java files. Then it's going to look for these special tags in the programs, in the comments of this program. And it's going to compile these things. It is also going to compile the code itself, and it's going to use both of these sources, both the Javadoc in the comments and the code itself, to actually generate the documentation. It can generate in various formats, but vastly most used format is hyperlinks or HTML code, a hyperlinked browsable document using HTML, hypertext document. So there are many different tools that can generate a lot of different outputs. Some of these outputs might be useful for some people, but the vast majority of cases, what you generate is actually HTML, so that you can actually post it on the internet. For example, you're developing a library, you make this library public, and you post HTML documentation on a website describing this library. That's what people often do when they have a GitHub. They also, GitHub is making the code public, and then there's a special folder where you can see the documentation. Most IDEs, as I will exemplify later, are actually integrate the use of Javadoc inside, and they have some options in the menus to actually trigger a generation of the Javadoc. Though Javadoc itself is also a command line tool, just such as exactly like the Java compiler and runtime system. It can be used in command line. So what are the advantages and slight disadvantages of this tool? So as I mentioned earlier, the program documentation process is coupled with the programming process, in the sense that the source of your documentation is inside of your code. So you don't have two different documents. You don't have the documentation and the code. The documentation source is actually inside of the code. So as a programmer, it makes it very easy for you to concentrate on your code. And as, for example, you make a change or add new code, it's very easy for you to keep on thinking of adding the documentation because it's right there inside of your code. So it's automated generation of the documentation. It's less error prone. It's much more efficient because it's automated using a compiler. It's very efficient also to update the documentation. You make a change to the code, documentation is right there. You can change the narrative of the description of the method you just changed according to the change that you just made, for example. It's you add a parameter to a certain method, and you just go add one add param in the description of this method, as we'll see later. So the code to documentation cycle is extremely short. So you make a change to your code, you make a change to the documentation, you generate your code, you compile your code, you generate the documentation. This can be done extremely quickly. And that's what you want to do to save some time and enable you to spend less time on documentation and more time on coding. Disadvantages, there's not many disadvantages to that. There's a learning curve, but as we will see, there's ways you can actually use that in a very, very simple manner. It's not at all complicated. Here we're gonna, as for many things, we're gonna use the tool in even a minimal fashion. The goal is not to use this tool, in a very complicated manner. The goal is to actually take the habit of using this tool properly. The most of the difficulty in using a tool like this is to take the habit of being dedicated to the use of this tool, consistent and relentless use of this tool. Okay. Every time you add new code, you add the Javadoc. Every time you make a change to some of your code, if it changes the nature of what this code is doing, or change the what this code is doing, then you should reflect that into the existing documentation. So it's a habit that's very important to pick up as you start using a tool like this. Because I repeat, if you write a new class and then you say, oh, I don't have time for Javadoc right now, then this class is not documented. So if somebody looks at the documentation, this class is not there. So documentation can be incomplete. If you make a change to a documentation, to a piece of code, you change the behavior of the piece of code, and then you forget or omit to change the documentation, the description of this method according to the change that you just made, and then somebody looks at the documentation, and suddenly what it says that this method is doing in the documentation, what it says there is not what actually this method is doing. It becomes misleading and can be costly actually for your documentation to be misleading. So very important that you take the habit of always, when you add code or change code, to also change the to add to the documentation and change the documentation. Now, this is how it looks like. Not important what is the nature of the code I'm documenting here. All I want to show is that this is the format of a Javadoc comment. So it starts with, yes, this is a block comment, except that the first line has 2 stars instead of 1. And each consecutive line here starts with a star. And then you have the end, a regular end of comment. So yes, as far as your Java compiler is concerned, this is just a block comment. Okay, it's no, from your compiler's perspective, there's no difference. This is just a comment. However, if you run the Javadoc tool on this code, it is going to be looking for this special format of comments. And then it is going to compile what is inside of this comment. Okay. So you have to respect this special syntax for your comments. Javadoc is also going to read your regular code, okay, which is as any other regular code. You don't have to write your code specially because it's going to be used by or compiled using Javadoc. There is also special tags that you may use inside of your Javadoc comments. For example, many of the HTML tags you can actually use. So if you want to create a bulleted list inside of your documentation, then you would use this regular HTML for creating a bulleted list. There is also many different tags that starts with @ which are special keywords that the Javadoc compiler would recognize. Okay. For example, if you want to specify who is the author of this code, then you go @author. If you want to specify what's the version of this code, then you put @since or @version. These, since you might be or you should be using a repository, you know, just by looking in the repository, you would actually know who actually wrote this code and what's the version of this code. So normally when you use Javadoc in conjunction with a repository, you would not use @author or @since or @version. So here is basically here describing what's the special format for comments. So it has to be, yes, it's a block comment, but you must have 2 stars here and every line must have a star to begin with. Then you have, here's some other special tags. So you can also use code, which is actually an HTML, another HTML tag, which actually would output this, what is in between the start code and end code into, I believe it's a Courier font or something that is formatted as it would look like code inside of the documentation that you would generate. Okay, so many of the HTML tags can actually be used inside of your Javadoc. Here, this is also using the paragraph to specify, to have a line break. You can use BR. So many of the HTML markers or tags can be used inside of your Javadoc. Then this is the corresponding code or output that is being generated by the Javadoc. So if you compile this here, this class here, or this file using Javadoc, then it's going to generate something like this. Depending on what version of Javadoc you're using, there's also possibility to customize the output. That's just one of the possible visualizations in the output. Of course, it's HTML, so you could use CSS formatting and so on, but we're not going to go there in this course. There is also some other rules. So for example, when you write your Javadoc, you have to absolutely, if you are providing documentation for a method. So that's here a method that I'm documenting. I have to absolutely have the Javadoc comment that is immediately preceding what I'm documenting. So if I'm documenting a method, this block of code here, this block comment that is a Javadoc comment should precede exactly this method here. If there's spaces or if there's other things here, Javadoc will not make the connection between the two. This is especially important for classes because very often at the top of the file before the class, you would have your imports. If you put your Javadoc before the imports, then Javadoc is not going to recognize the connection between your Javadoc and the class because the imports are going to be in the way. So there's quite a few details like this that you have to take care of. Another thing is very important to understand that Javadoc is an API documentation. So it only enables you to document what is externally visible from these components. So, for example, a class is something that is externally visible and can be used by other components, by other classes. And then the methods inside of the class can also potentially be used externally. But the variables that are declared inside of your methods are not externally visible. So you cannot, it doesn't make sense to try to put some Javadoc comments inside of methods because they are, what's inside of the methods is not externally visible. Okay. So as I hinted at before, you have plenty of Javadoc tags that you can use. I'm not going to go, I'm not going to require that you use any of these tags. What I'm requiring, as I'll hint, as I'll explain at the end of this video, is that you consistently have Javadoc for every class and for every method of every class. I'm not going to aside for the documentation of the methods, parameters, and return type, I'm not going to require that you use a lot of different tags. So you can have your @author, @version, @c, and so on. There's plenty of tags like this you can use, but I'm not going to require that you use them. So that would be, for example, an example of a documentation for a class. In our case, I'm just going to require that you have a very simple paragraph that's describing what is the purpose of your class, and that you do that consistently for every class. Very important that you understand when there's going to be the grading for your builds. There's going to be like a few marks, for example, like 5 marks for the entire project. It's going to be 5 marks for your Javadoc out of 50, for example. How the marking is going to happen is that if we look in your code and there's one class whose Javadoc is missing, you lose 1 mark. Every time a piece of Javadoc is missing, you lose 1 mark. So you see that you could have like dozens of classes in your code. Every time you missed one Javadoc element, you lose 1 mark. So it's not like you have 50% of the marks if you have 50% of the Javadoc. No, it's going to be very stringent. It's going to be severe grading, if you might say that. It's very important that it's done consistently. So that's why it needs to be drastic grading like this. So that was for the classes documentation. If you are documenting methods, which I'm going to require that every method of every class is documented, then the most important, some of the important things about a method is the list of its parameters and what's the purpose of these parameters. So in order to document a method, then you would have to need to have an at param. Let me check the pointer. You should have, or you must have, an at param for every parameter of your methods. And you can, you should also have an at return for every of your methods. Even if it's returning void, then you can have at return and then void. You could also document manually the throws. If a method is potentially throwing a certain exception, then you can put it. But the fact of the matter is that Javadoc will actually get this information already from compiling of the code. Okay. So there is a lot of useful information that is going to be in the documentation that Javadoc actually gets from the code itself. If you want to add something additional, you may, but the code itself, especially in the case of throws, will Javadoc will get it from the code itself. Okay, so let's say you have a method like this. Then you have this paragraph here that is describing what is this method doing. This is your Javadoc comment here to describe this method. This paragraph describes what this method is doing. Then you have for each parameter, you have an at param with the name of the parameter, then a single sentence describing what this parameter is used for or should be used for. And then you have an at return that describes what is returned by this method. And then for every method in your code, in your entire code base, you should have one such Javadoc comment. And that would be an example of what is generated by the Javadoc, which is then a browsable document. Now, how do you generate it? If you're using an IDE, you probably have an option that you can use to actually generate the documentation. There might be some options that you want to use. For example, if you want to force the creation of the documentation for private members or for a specific version or a specific author, then you have a lot of different options that you can use. Okay. Not necessarily that you want to use these particular ones for the project, but there is quite a number of options that you can use. One of them that is most useful for this project is to check if some of the documentation is missing. For example, if you use the -x.lint :missing for this class here, then if there is, for example, in this particular file, if there are methods that are not documented, then this would actually list those for which it's documented. So you should take the habit of using that. And as you check each other's code and you compile, to actually look out for the output of such a command to see what Javadoc is actually missing. The point is that we're actually going to use this for the grading. So as you will do your demonstration, then the marker will ask you to run this command, and then we'll see how many things are missing. For every things that are missing, you are going to have marked deductions. The summary. So this kind of tool is improving the productivity of the programmers by increasing the browsability and the readability and the understandability of the code. So we're all using each other's code, especially in incremental software development. We need to be able to quickly understand each other's code. It's hard to understand each other's code, then we spend less time coding and more time trying to understand each other's code. So the more the code is understandable, browsable, readable, the more we are productive in producing more code. Javadoc code is also documentation inside of the code. So even though you don't generate the HTML documentation, the actual documentation is, the source of the documentation is in the code. So as you're looking at the code, you can actually look at, let's say you're looking for a certain method. So you go to this method, and right on top here, then you have the documentation of this method that tells you what this method is, how to use it properly. So even inside of the code, it is useful documentation, even if it's not the HTML version of the actual documentation. So the tool is very important. Why it is economically viable practice to use this kind of, to create this kind of documentation, because it uses a tool that will automate the generation of the documentation. And very important, if you are to use this, then it absolutely requires a lot of dedication and rigor in using using this. It has to be, you know, every team member has to be totally dedicated in using this tool. If some of your team members decide one day that they're not doing it, and then your documentation becomes either incomplete or obsolete. Which is kind of it's likely that if somebody is not doing it, then other people will see that somebody is not doing it, and they'll be saying, "Oh, well, why am I doing it if it's not complete?" And then suddenly, a lot more and more people start not doing it, and suddenly it becomes a hindrance rather than something useful. Okay. So it requires dedication and rigor. If you want it to be really useful, it requires dedication and rigor. How to do this in the project? So you're required to use Javadoc. You must have Javadoc for every class, and you must have Javadoc for every method of every class. For every parameter of every method, you should have an add param, and every method should have an at, and every method's documentation, Javadoc documentation, must have an at return. And you are also required to integrate the Javadoc compilation inside of your continuous integration pipeline. So you should go to the lab. There are some slides explaining you that. If that's not clear for you, then go to the lab, and that's going to be explained to you. So that the idea here is that as you make a commit, and then you push your commit to the GitHub, and the GitHub is going to trigger the execution of the Javadoc. Okay. Then if you combine it with, for example, the xlint, the x.lint, then every time you commit, then you can actually see if there are some missing documentation. So that helps you to keep control of the completeness or quality of your documentation. That's it for this. Thank you.